The crystal wine glass shattered against the polished marble floor, raining diamond-like shards over Deborah's scuffed white sneakers. "Are you blind, stupid, or just utterly useless?" Mrs. Chin, the head housekeeper of the Ryu estate, hissed the words, her face flushed with a terrifying mix of panic and rage. She grabbed Deborah by the shoulder of her gray uniform, her manicured nails biting into the young woman's collarbone. "Clean it up, now, before he arrives. If there is a single speck of dust when the young master walks through those doors, I will have you scrubbing the courtyard stones with a toothbrush." Deborah didn't sigh. She didn't even look up into Mrs. Chin's furious eyes. Over the past year, Deborah had perfected the art of becoming part of the wallpaper. As the only black maid in the sprawling, terrifyingly powerful Korean mafia household, she had learned early on that invisibility was her only armor. It protected her against the daily barrage of mockery, the whispered insults in the hallways, and the intentionally spilled coffee that she was always forced to clean. She dropped to her bare knees, bowing her head as she began sweeping the razor-sharp fragments into her palms. Her hands were already calloused from bleach and boiling water, but as she pressed down, a jagged edge of the crystal sliced deep into the pad of her thumb. A bright, thick bead of crimson welled up, stark and shocking against her rich, dark skin. Before she could wipe it away, the massive oak doors of the grand foyer groaned open. Silence slammed into the room. It was absolute. Ryu Jin-woo had returned. He moved like a shadow detached from the night, tall, broad-shouldered, radiating an icy, lethal authority that made the temperature in the cavernous foyer plummet. For 2 years, he had been systematically destroying rival syndicates and expanding the family's underworld empire in Europe. Now, the undisputed king of Seoul's underworld was home. Every maid, every armed guard, and every senior staff member in the room instantly folded at the waist in a crisp, terrified 90-degree bow. Mrs. Chin trembled, her head practically touching her knees, her breath hitching in her throat. Deborah remained on the floor, head bowed, clutching the broken glass, trying desperately to make herself as small as possible. She waited for his polished black Oxfords to stride past her as fast as possible, because she was nothing but a smudge on the pristine floor of his empire. But the footsteps stopped. Right in front of her. Deborah held her breath. Slowly, agonizingly, Jin-woo crouched. The rustle of his bespoke charcoal suit was the only sound in the room. Suddenly, the scent of heavy rain, cold cedar, and expensive dark tobacco enveloped her. He didn't look at Mrs. Chin, neither did he look at his bowing soldiers. His dark, piercing eyes were locked entirely on Deborah, more specifically, on the blood dripping from her hand onto his immaculate floor. Without a word, Jin-woo reached into the breast pocket of his suit, withdrew a slate-gray silk handkerchief, and took her hand. Deborah flinched, a tiny, involuntary gasp escaping her lips. No one in this house had touched her with anything but malice in over a year. His large, scarred hands were shockingly warm. His grip was firm, yet impossibly gentle as he wrapped the silk around her bleeding thumb. "Leave the glass." His voice was a low, dark velvet rumble that sent a violent shiver straight down her spine. "You are bleeding." He stood. His gaze swept over the paralyzed staff with a terrifying, hollow emptiness, chilling them to the bone, before he turned and walked up the grand staircase. Deborah knelt frozen on the marble, his silk handkerchief clutched in her trembling hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The invisible maid had just been seen. The shift in the mansion was not instantaneous, but it was an undeniable, creeping current that electrified the air. Deborah's days had always been defined by exhaustion. Up at 4 in the morning, scrubbing the grand industrial kitchens, cooking the staff meals, quietly taking the hardest shifts that the other maids, like the spiteful Yoonjae, pushed onto her. "It's not like you have anywhere to be, Deborah," Yoonjae would sneer, tossing her soiled aprons into Deborah's laundry basket. "Make yourself useful." Deborah had accepted her lot. She kept her dignity intact through silence, through the quiet pride of her own resilience. She thought she was entirely alone. But Jin-woo was watching. He noticed the way she slipped her own meager lunch portions to the stray cats by the back gates in the freezing rain. He noticed how she never raised her voice when Mrs. Chin berated her for dust that didn't exist. He saw the quiet, unbreakable steel in her spine. Where others saw a target, Ryu Jin-woo saw a queen walking among peasants. His fascination quickly morphed into a quiet, consuming obsession. 2 mornings after his arrival, Jin-woo sat at the head of the massive mahogany dining table, staring at his black coffee. Yoon-jae stood nearby, batting her eyelashes, a sickly sweet smile plastered on her face. "Who made this?" Jin-woo asked. "I did, young master," Yoon-jae lied smoothly, stepping closer. "Exactly the way you like it." Jin-woo's eyes, cold and dead, flicked to Yoon-jae. He didn't raise his voice, but the menace in his tone made the guards at the door stiffen. "If you ever lie to me again, I will have you removed from this house and dropped in the middle of the Han River. The black woman made this. Bring her to me." Yoon-jae paled, stumbling backward as she bowed frantically. Minutes later, Deborah was pushed into the dining room by a scowling Mrs. Chin. Deborah kept her eyes on the floor, her hands clasped tightly over her apron. "You asked for me, sir," she whispered. "Look at me," Jin-woo commanded softly. Deborah hesitated, then slowly raised her chin. For the first time, she truly looked into the eyes of the Mafia boss. They were dark, bottomless, and completely transfixed on her. "From now on," Jin-woo said, his gaze tracing the delicate curve of her jaw, the richness of her skin, "no one prepares my meals but you. No one pours my tea but you. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," she breathed, entirely bewildered. From that day on, Deborah was summoned. The hierarchy of the mansion began to violently fracture. Mrs. Chin seethed as she watched the lowest-ranking maid bypass her authority, walking straight into the master's private quarters. When Jin-woo worked late into the night, negotiating arms deals and syndicate treaties over encrypted lines, he demanded Deborah be in the room. He never asked her to clean. He pointed to the plush, oversized leather armchair in the corner of his study room. "Sit," he told her the first night. "Sir, I should be helping in the kitchens." "Sit, Deborah." It was the first time he had said her name. The way the syllables rolled off his tongue gave her a different feeling. He handed her a first edition novel from his shelf. "Read. If you fall asleep, that is fine. But you do not leave this room until I do." For hours, the most dangerous man in Korea would pause his work, mute his calls, and simply watch her read in the dim golden light of the study. He watched the way her brow furrowed when she concentrated. He watched the steady, calming rhythm of her breathing. To Jin-woo, a man who had lived his entire life in a world of betrayal, blood, and calculated lies, the quiet authenticity of this woman was a drug. He was rapidly becoming addicted. The breaking point for the household came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Mrs. Chin, furious that her control was slipping, cornered Deborah in the scullery. "You think you are special," Mrs. Chin spat, shoving a bucket of heavy lye and a wire brush into Deborah's chest. "You are nothing, a distraction. Scrub the basement cellars, all of them, and don't come up until your hands bleed." Deborah took the bucket, her face had gone frown. She turned toward the basement doors, accepting the humiliation, when a large, impeccably tailored arm reached out and intercepted the bucket, ripping it from her grasp. The bucket clattered loudly to the tile floor. Jin-woo stood there, his jaw locked, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying fury as he looked at Mrs. Chin. The older woman visibly shrank, choking on a gasp. "If you ever speak to her in that tone again," Jin-woo whispered, stepping toward the housekeeper, "I will cut out your tongue." Mrs. Chin dropped to her knees, weeping in terror. Jin-woo didn't even glance at her. He turned to Deborah, his eyes instantly softening, the monster retreating behind the man. "Leave your apron," he said. "Get your coat." "Sir, I have chores." "Your only chore is me." He led her out of the mansion, ignoring the gaping mouths of the security detail. The guards scrambled to open the doors of the armored Maybach, but Jin-woo waved them off. He opened the door for Deborah himself, placing a protective hand at the small of her back as she slid into the buttery leather interior. He took her into the heart of Seoul, to a private, Michelin-starred restaurant reserved for diplomats and billionaires. When they walked in, the entire establishment seemed to freeze. Waiters in white gloves stumbled over their steps, their minds short-circuiting as they tried to process why the undisputed king of the city was pulling out a chair for a woman wearing a faded, oversized winter coat over a maid's uniform. Jin-woo didn't care. He sat across from her, resting his chin on his hands, looking at her as if they were the only two people breathing on Earth. "You don't have to look at the prices," he said quietly as she nervously scanned the menu. Tell me what you want, Deborah. Why are you doing this? She finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. I'm nobody, I'm just a maid. Jin-woo's expression tightened. He reached across the table, his warm, rough fingers gently covering her small, work-worn hands. You are not nobody. For a year, this house has treated you like a shadow, but I see you. I see how you endure. I see your kindness in a world that gives you none in return. His thumb slowly stroked the back of her hand. You are never going to be invisible again. The annual Dragon Syndicate Gala was the social pinnacle of the underworld elite. It was a night of brutal politics, shifting power, and unspoken threats hidden behind diamonds and champagne. Mrs. Chin, driven to madness by a toxic mix of jealousy and desperation, decided to make her final play. On the afternoon of the gala, she lured Deborah to the basement archives, a labyrinth of heavy steel doors and decades of physical receipts. Count the inventory in Section 4, Mrs. Chin barked. As soon as Deborah stepped inside, the heavy steel door slammed shut behind her. The lock clicked heavily into place. The lights were cut. Know your place, you filthy rat, Mrs. Chin hissed through the thick metal. When he leaves for the gala without you, he will remember that you are nothing but unreliable trash. Deborah plunged into total darkness. She pressed her hands against the freezing steel door, her breath hitching. She never attempted to scream because none of her screaming in this house had ever brought rescue. She sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, the cold seeping into her bones. She was right, Deborah thought, a single tear cutting through the dust on her cheek. I will always just be a maid in the dark. She was in the pitch black for 3 hours. When the door finally exploded open, the metal groaning as the locking mechanism was literally shot to pieces. The light blinded her. It wasn't Mrs. Chin standing there but Jin-woo. He was breathing heavily, his suit jacket discarded, his dress shirt rolled up to his forearms, a silenced pistol gripped tightly in his right hand. The look on his face was one of absolute murderous panic until his eyes found her huddled on the floor. He dropped the gun and it clattered against the concrete. Jin-woo crossed the room, falling to his knees and pulling Deborah against his chest. He crushed her to himself, his hands burying into her hair, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He was shaking. I've got you, he breathed fiercely. I've got you. I swear I am going to burn this house to the ground. He scooped her into his arms, carrying her out of the basement as effortlessly as if she weighed nothing. He bypassed the screaming, terrified staff in the hallways and carried her straight to the master's suite. Waiting inside was a team of Europe's most exclusive stylists, flown in hours prior. Make her look like the queen she is, Jin-woo ordered, stepping out to give her privacy. For 2 hours, Deborah was pampered like royalty. When she finally stepped in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, she gasped. The invisible, tired, overworked girl was gone. She wore a breathtaking dress crafted from midnight blue velvet, designed to cling perfectly to her curves and contrast brilliantly against the rich, glowing undertones of her dark skin. Her hair was styled in an elegant, sweeping updo that showcased her striking features. Around her neck sat a heavy, cold diamond collar, a piece of jewelry worth $1 million. Jin-woo stepped back into the room, wearing a fresh tuxedo. He stopped dead in his tracks, his breath visibly caught in his throat. Then he walked slowly toward her, his eyes dark with a possessive fire that made her pulse pound. He stepped behind her, resting his hands on her bare shoulders, his thumbs tracing her collarbone in the mirror. Tonight, he whispered, his lips grazing her ear, they will all see exactly what I see. When the armored Maybach pulled up to the Grand Hyatt, the flash of paparazzi cameras turned the night into day. When Ryu Jin-woo entered the ballroom, the string quartet seemed to stutter. Conversations died in an instant. Every head turned, expecting the king to arrive with a political heiress, or perhaps the daughter of a rival boss. Instead, his arm was wrapped possessively, securely around the waist of a breathtaking black woman radiating absolute, quiet majesty. Whispers erupted like wildfire across the ballroom. Who is she? A foreign diplomat? A black heiress? Look at the diamonds on her neck. Deborah's heart raced, her grip tightening on Jin-woo's arm. He felt her anxiety and pulled her closer, kissing the side of her head in front of 500 of the most dangerous people in Asia. An arrogant underboss from the south, a man named Choi, fueled by too much imported whiskey and old-world entitlement, stepped directly into their path, laughing loudly. Jin-woo, Choi slurred, looking Deborah up and down with blatant disgust. What is this? Has the great Ryu family fallen so low that they are bringing the hired help to the high table now? I hear she washes your floors. The air in the room instantly evaporated. The silence that followed was so profound, Deborah could hear the ice melting in the glasses of the terrified guests nearby. Jin-woo didn't even blink, but his face became a mask of terrifying, demonic calm. He slowly let go of Deborah's waist. He picked up a crystal champagne flute from the tray of a paralyzed waiter. He didn't hesitate. With blinding speed, Jin-woo smashed the flute against the edge of a mahogany table and drove the jagged, razor-sharp stems straight through the back of Choi's hand, pinning it violently into the wood. Choi let out an agonizing, blood-curdling scream, dropping to his knees as blood poured over the white tablecloth. Jin-woo leaned over the screaming man, his voice carrying whisper that echoed flawlessly across the dead-silent ballroom. She is my woman, Jin-woo stated, looking around the room, making eye contact with every boss, politician, and the entire rival. She is the air I breathe. She sits above all of you. If anyone in this room so much as looks at her with anything less than absolute reverence, I will tear down your families stone by stone, and I will erase your bloodlines from history. He pulled a fresh silk handkerchief from his pocket, wiped his hands, and tossed it onto Choi's writhing chest. Jin-woo turned back to Deborah. The monster vanished instantly. He offered his arm with a gentle, adoring, breathtaking smile. Shall we sit, my love? The backlash to the public claiming was desperate and swift. Park Min-ah, a venomous, fiercely wealthy heiress who had been politically promised to Jin-woo before his departure to Europe, refused to accept defeat. She cornered Deborah later that evening in the opulent, marble-lined women's powder room. Min-ah's face was twisted in ugly, unrestrained jealousy. She backed Deborah toward the sinks, flanked by two of her own security. Do not think you've won, Min-ah snarled, pointing a manicured finger at Deborah's chest. You are a phase, a charity case, a stray dog he brought inside out of the rain. You wipe floors. When he is bored of playing savior, when the politics of this world demand a real wife, you will be thrown back into the gutters where you belong. A week ago, Deborah would have lowered her eyes. She would have apologized and made herself small. But the diamond collar on her neck was heavy, and the love of a king had fortified her spine. Deborah looked at Min-ah, her posture perfectly straight, her eyes calm and utterly unafraid. If I am just a phase, Deborah said softly, her voice echoing in the marble room, why are your hands shaking? Min-ah let out a screech of rage and raised her hand to slap Deborah across the face. That was when the bathroom door was kicked open with such explosive force that the brass hinges snapped. Jin-woo stood in the doorway, the demon of soul fully unleashed. He crossed the room in two massive strides, catching Min-ah's wrist inches from Deborah's face. He twisted it until the heiress gasped in excruciating pain, falling to her knees. Her security guards reached for their weapons, but a dozen of Jin-woo's men poured into the room, pressing guns to the guards' heads before they could draw. The Ryu family's alliance with the Park Corporation is permanently terminated, Jin-woo stated, looking down at Min-ah with absolute disgust. Your ports, your shipping lines, your underground clubs, they belong to me now. Tell your father he has your pathetic arrogance to thank for his ruin. He dropped her arm and stepped over her crying form and turned to Deborah, the rage in his eyes instantly melting into deep, desperate protectiveness. He gently cupped her cheeks in his large hands, searching her eyes. Did she touch you? He asked, his voice rough. Are you hurt? No, Deborah whispered, leaning her face into his warm palm, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of safety. I'm okay, because of you. Always, he promised, pulling her into his chest. The next morning, the sun rose over a Ryu estate that was entirely unrecognizable. Deborah walked out of the master bedroom, wearing a flowing silk robe that Jin-woo had draped over her shoulders. Her hand was firmly enclosed in his. As they reached the top of the grand, sweeping staircase, she paused, her breath catching in her throat. Lined up in the grand foyer from the front door all the way to the dining room was the entire staff. Every maid, every guard, every cook. At the very front stood Mrs. Chin and Yoonjae. Their faces were ashen, stripped of all their previous arrogance. Their eyes were fixed on the marble floor in absolute, unadulterated terror. Bags were packed and waiting by the door. As Jin-woo and Deborah took their first step down the stairs, the staff moved as one. They folded deeply into a synchronized, perfect 90-degree bow. But they weren't bowing to Jin-woo. "Good morning, my lady," the staff echoed in perfect unison, their voices trembling with the forced respect and terror they had once violently denied her. Jin-woo stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He looked down at the head housekeeper. "Mrs. Chin, Yoon-jae, you have 1 hour to disappear. If I ever see your faces in Seoul again, I will not be as forgiving as my queen." Mrs. Chin sobbed, her forehead touching the marble floor she had once threatened to make Deborah scrub with a toothbrush. Yoon-jae shook so violently she could barely stand. Deborah stood on the exact spot on the floor where she had once bled in silence, clutching broken glass. She looked at the bowing heads. She looked at the people who had tried to grind her into the dirt, now forced to worship the ground she walked on. The injustice she had swallowed for a year finally evaporated, replaced by a deep, resonant satisfaction. Jin-woo stepped behind her. He pulled her gently by the waist, pressing her back against his chest, completely indifferent to the eyes of his staff. He pressed his lips softly to the crown of her head, inhaling deeply. "They see you now," he murmured against her skin, his arms wrapping around her in a fortress of absolute, unyielding devotion. "They will bow to you for the rest of their lives, but they will never, ever worship you the way I do." Deborah looked up into the dark, obsessive, beautiful eyes of the Mafia king who had burned his own world down just to keep her warm. She smiled, her heart full, finally stepping completely out of the shadows. The invisible maid was gone forever, while the queen of the empire had arrived. I still remain Charles your Ritter and director of secret Mafia love. See you all in the next one, and always remember Jesus loves you.